She only asked for one night in his old barn. He never expected her to rebuild his whole life. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind had picked up just before nightfall, howling like a wounded animal across the open fields. Rain lashed against the crooked windows of the farmhouse as Thomas Hayes stood on the porch, mug in hand, watching his cows huddle near the tree line. He'd seen storms like this before, flooded roads, snapped power lines, that particular kind of quiet that comes right before the thunder cracks open the sky. The barn creaked in protest as gusts tore through the valley. It wasn't much to look at anymore, that barn. Leaning a little too far to the left, patched with mismatched boards, roof sagging like it carried the weight of too many broken seasons. But it was still standing, just like him. He was about to turn in when the headlights appeared, two soft orbs cutting through the sheets of rain, slowing near his property like they were unsure whether to continue or give up altogether. The car, a sleek black SUV far too clean for country roads, crawled to a stop near the barn. And then he saw her. She stepped out slowly, shielding her face from the rain with one arm, her boots sinking into the muddy gravel. Her coat looked expensive, but it clung to her like paper now, soaked through. She didn't run or wave frantically. She just stood there beside the car, eyes scanning the barn like it was the last place on earth she wanted to be, and the only one she had left. Thomas set his mug down and stepped off the porch without thinking. No umbrella, no hesitation. Just the instinct of a man who didn't let people freeze on his land. "Ma'am," he called over the storm, "you all right?" She looked up. There was something in her eyes, drenched but not desperate, tired but holding on. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, voice raised above the wind. "I just needed somewhere dry." He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He just gestured to the barn and said, "Ain't much, but the roof holds." She nodded once, clutching her coat tighter. As she stepped inside, lightning lit up the valley behind her. Thomas didn't know her name, didn't ask. He just handed her an old blanket and said, "You can stay. One night." He had no idea that one night would change everything. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it fell harder, angrier, like the sky was working through something it hadn't said out loud in years. Thomas stood just inside the barn's doorway, watching the stranger settle in. She didn't ask for much, just a corner near the hay bales, somewhere dry. She didn't flinch at the smell of old wood and animal sweat, didn't wrinkle her nose at the draft whistling through the gaps in the boards. She just took the blanket he'd handed her, sat down, and pulled her knees to her chest like she'd done this before. Weathered worse than this, maybe. He thought about asking her name, but something about the way she looked at the floor, the way she let silence stretch between them, made him decide against it. People who need shelter don't always need questions. They just need a roof and a bit of grace. "You'll be all right out here?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, not looking up. "One night," she said. "That's all I need." The wind rattled the barn doors again, but she didn't flinch. Thomas hesitated. Then he nodded once and turned to leave. He didn't make it far. Just as he reached the doorway, her voice followed him, not loud, not desperate, just soft. "Elise." He turned. She was still sitting there, hands wrapped tight around the edges of the blanket. "My name's Elise," she said again, like it cost her something to say it. Thomas gave her a nod. "Thomas." Neither smiled. It wasn't that kind of moment. He stepped out into the storm, pulling the barn door shut behind him. It groaned, but closed firm. Inside, Elise was just a shadow behind old wood and dim lantern light. He figured she'd be gone by morning. That's how these things usually went. People passed through, took what shelter they needed, and disappeared with the sunrise. But as he crossed the muddy yard back toward the farmhouse, something about her lingered. Maybe it was the steadiness in her voice, or the way she didn't look scared, just finished. One night, no questions. That was the deal. And yet, Thomas couldn't help but wonder why it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the start of something he couldn't name. The morning crept in slow, dragging a pale light across the frost-tipped fields. Thomas rose before the sun fully did, as he always did, out of habit, not desire. The house was cold, the kind of cold that lingered in your bones until mid-morning. He tugged on his boots, reached for his coat, and stepped outside. The storm had passed. The air was still wet with its memory, and puddles dotted the dirt path between the house and the barn. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe an empty blanket? A polite note? Maybe nothing at all. But when he pushed open the barn door, the first thing that hit him was the smell. Coffee. Rich, dark, not from his rusted old tin of instant grounds, but something better, something smooth, something real. Elise stood near a small camp stove, steam rising from a tin kettle like breath in the cold air. She turned when she heard him, her hair pulled back, cheeks still pink from the chill, but her expression warm. "I found your kettle," she said. "Hope you don't mind. Figured coffee might make the morning easier." Thomas blinked. "You made coffee in my barn?" She smiled. "I make a mean cup. City habit." He took the offered mug, still not sure what to make of her. The first sip confirmed it. She wasn't lying. It was the best coffee he'd had in years. He didn't say so, just nodded, quiet approval. She didn't sit down again. Instead, she looked around the barn like it held secrets. "This place has character," she said, walking past the tools, hanging like tired soldiers on the wall. "Why haven't you sold it?" Thomas looked at her, unsure how to answer. He hadn't expected questions, but she was looking at him the way people do when they actually want to hear the answer. "Because it was my father's," he said finally, "and his before him. Land might not be worth much to others, but to me, it's the last thing I've got that still remembers my name." Elise nodded, quiet for a long beat. Then gently, "That's a good reason." They stood in silence, drinking coffee in a barn too old to shine, but too proud to crumble. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas didn't feel like the only person who understood what that meant. The day had warmed just enough to pull the mist off the ground, leaving the barn bathed in that soft, mid-morning glow only country mornings could conjure. Thomas had just come back from checking the fence line when he saw her dragging her duffel toward the porch, boots slipping slightly in the mud. The bag was soaked through, dripping a quiet rhythm with each step. She grunted, trying to keep it from tearing on the gravel path. Without a word, Thomas crossed the yard and took it from her hands. It was heavier than it looked. Leather. Real leather. The kind that didn't belong on a farm. He carried it inside, setting it gently just past the threshold of the kitchen, near the old stove, where warmth still clung to the air. "That bag take a beating?" he asked casually, grabbing a towel from the hook and tossing it her way. She caught it and smiled faintly. "It's been through worse." He crouched beside the bag, about to unzip it for her, when the initials caught his eye, embossed in the corner in precise gold lettering, ERRS. 3 letters, clean and quiet, but they struck him harder than any hammer ever had. ERS Elise, something. Then it hit him. Elise Sinclair. He'd seen the name once or twice, flashing across the bottom of a television screen at the diner. Articles about stock surges, headlines about a business prodigy, photos of a woman in black heels shaking hands with people in suits worth more than his entire property. He remembered the face vaguely now, cleaned up and untouchable in those photos. It matched the woman now standing in his kitchen, except this version was wearing his flannel and had a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He didn't say anything, not yet. Just finished drying off the bag and slid it gently against the wall. She noticed the shift in his posture, the stillness in his hands. "You all right?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes steady. "You said Elise. Didn't say Sinclair." She met his gaze without flinching. "Didn't think it mattered." He paused, then nodded once. "Maybe it doesn't." But deep down something had changed. He didn't know what a billionaire was doing in his barn or why she was asking about fences and farmland, but he knew one thing for sure: she wasn't just passing through. The first night was a storm. The second was calm. The third was unexpected. Elise didn't leave. She didn't say she was staying either, but her actions spoke louder than any explanation could. By the next evening, her bag was still tucked under the stairs in the farmhouse. She'd traded her sleek black coat for one of Thomas's spare flannels, slightly too big and smelling faintly of pine oil and old tobacco. No one mentioned it, but it looked right on her. She didn't ask for a room, didn't sleep in the house. She returned to the barn each night, curling up with that same thick blanket near the hayloft, next to the radio she found buried in a pile of tools. In the mornings, she was already up by the time Thomas came out, feeding the chickens or refilling the metal water troughs without being told. By the end of the week, she'd fixed the latch on the chicken coop, organized the tools by size and function, and mended a rip in one of his old work gloves with thread she said she kept in her bag, just in case. He asked her once, standing beneath the shade of the old pecan tree, "You ever worked a farm before?" She smirked, wiping sweat from her brow. "Never, but it's not rocket science, is it?" "No," he admitted. "It's just a lot of stubbornness and scraped knuckles." She nodded. "Sounds familiar." That's what puzzled him most. She wasn't playing at being helpful. She didn't flinch at manure or mud. She didn't wince when she slipped and banged her shin on the tractor's hitch. She just breathed through the pain and got back up. And more than that, she listened. Really listened. When he talked about his father's last season before the heart attack, she didn't fill the silence with cliches. When he mentioned his wife's favorite daffodils still blooming by the fence, she looked toward them and smiled as if she could see her there. She didn't stay because she had to. She stayed because she wanted to, because the barn didn't scare her, the dust didn't bother her. And maybe, just maybe, something about the brokenness around her felt like home. Thomas didn't say much, but every time she stayed another night, he made sure there was fresh firewood stacked beside the barn door. No questions, no expectations, just quiet permission to stay. It didn't take long before the town started noticing. Maple Hollow wasn't a place where much went unseen. A new truck on Main Street turned heads. A stranger buying coffee at Maisie's Cafe got 3 versions of their backstory imagined before the cup was even poured. So when a woman like Elise started showing up in town in boots too clean to be farm-worn and eyes too sharp to belong to a drifter, people noticed. At first it was simple curiosity. She showed up at the Saturday farmers market helping Thomas stack crates of turnips and haul hay bales for Mrs. Loring's goats. Folks saw her kneel in the dirt beside old Henry Barlow's tomato stand, asking what kind of fertilizer worked best on his side of the ridge. Not the kind of questions tourists ask, not small talk. Then she started showing up at the co-op, flipping through seed catalogs with the patience of someone who planned to plant, not just browse. She asked about irrigation, fencing, crop rotation. She scribbled notes on a pad that looked suspiciously like leather. No one knew what to make of it. "She's some kind of ag consultant," someone whispered at the gas station. "Looks more like a runaway," someone else muttered at the feed store. "Too clean to be real, too quiet to be up to no good." "She's got Sinclair eyes," said Maisie over pie slices, not knowing how close she was to the truth. Thomas didn't offer answers. When folks asked, he just shrugged, said she was helping out for a while, didn't offer a label, didn't claim her. But he also didn't correct the rumors, and that said more than anything else. Elise didn't seem to care. She shook hands when people offered them, smiled when someone held a door. She listened. And not the way most outsiders did, polite nods and empty hums. She listened like every word mattered, and soon people started talking back. Even the town's hard shells cracked a little. When Sheriff Donnelly saw her hauling fencing supplies, he tipped his hat and said, "We don't see many new faces twice in 1 week." She just smiled and said, "Maybe that's about to change." By the end of that week, Elise wasn't a mystery. She was a rumor. But not the bad kind, the kind that lingered like perfume, the kind people leaned into, eager to find out what came next. It happened quietly, like most of Elise's decisions. No grand announcement, no big conversation, just a morning where Thomas stepped outside, coffee steaming in his hand, and nearly dropped the mug when he saw the truck in the yard. Two men stood beside it, unloading beams and bundled shingles like they belonged there. They waved at him like they'd been coming to the farm for years. One of them tipped his cap and said, "We're here to fix the roof." Thomas blinked. "What roof?" The man pointed toward the barn, the one with a hole big enough to baptize cattle. He looked toward the barn, squinting, and there it was. A crew already climbing, tools strapped to their belts, balancing on that old wood with a kind of careless confidence only roofers had. Elise stepped out from the barn just then, her sleeves rolled up and a smear of dirt across her cheek. She carried a clipboard and looked like she was born with it in her hand. "You call this in?" Thomas asked, still stunned. She nodded casually, figured it was time. "Elise, that roof's been caving in for years. It'd cost a fortune." She didn't blink. "Then it's long overdue." But, he stopped himself, looked at the workers again, then at her. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "It's not just about the wood. I needed the light to get in." The words didn't make sense at first, not in the way dollars and cents did, but then he looked again at the broken panels of that old roof, the way sunlight now streamed through the cracks like gold spilled from heaven. And maybe she was right. The light was coming in now, not filtered through dust and gaps, but real. She didn't need his permission, and somehow that didn't make it feel less generous. It made it feel deliberate, like she hadn't done it to fix something. She'd done it because she believed something better could grow there. Thomas didn't argue, just nodded slowly. And when the first new board went up, nailed in place with a clean, bright pop, he realized it wasn't just the barn that was changing. Something else was being rebuilt, something neither of them had quite named yet. The new roof went up faster than expected. By the end of the week, the barn no longer looked like it was on its last breath. The sunlight that filtered in through the new skylight bathed everything in a kind of golden hush, the kind that made old things feel sacred instead of broken. Thomas found himself lingering there more, just standing, watching dust dance through light like it had a purpose. Elise was different too, not louder, not softer, just more rooted. Like she'd settled into the space beneath her feet and decided not to run this time. She laughed easier, slept a little longer, asked about the orchard that hadn't borne fruit since Thomas's wife passed and what kind of wheat worked best in hard soil. But that night, after supper, when the sky turned that velvet shade of indigo and the stars began to whisper, Thomas sat on the porch and watched her return from the barn with dirt on her knees and a nail in her pocket. She dropped it in a jar by the door, her 5th one this week. "Elise," he said, voice calm but direct. She paused at the step. "Can I ask you something?" Her eyes flicked to his, guarded but not cold. "Of course." "Who are you really?" The question hung there, heavier than it should have been. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was the ache of a man trying to make sense of how someone could walk into his quiet, broken life and begin mending things without ever being asked. Elise didn't look away. She didn't pretend not to understand. She just stepped closer, rested her hand on the porch railing, and took a breath. "I'm someone who needed to remember what real looks like." That was all. No big confession, no full name, just truth, stripped of polish. Thomas stared at her for a moment, then nodded once. He didn't need more, not tonight, not when her voice sounded like it belonged on this land more than any storm ever had. They sat in silence after that, side by side, no questions, just stars above and nails in a jar, marking not repairs, but beginnings. The morning came with a hush that only early autumn could carry, cool, still, and full of a quiet promise that hadn't been felt on the Hayes farm in years. Thomas had just finished mending a fence post near the creek when he spotted her walking toward him, boots brushing through the wild grass, a folder tucked under her arm. She looked hesitant but not nervous, determined maybe. And that was the part that made Thomas's stomach twist a little, because Elise never walked over with anything tucked under her arm unless something was about to change. "Got a minute?" she asked. Thomas set the hammer down on a fence rail, brushing off his hands. "Always." She handed him the folder. Inside were papers, clean, crisp, the kind that smelled like a lawyer's office. Deeds, proposals, offers with too many zeros. "I want to help," she said gently. "Buy a portion, just enough to lighten the load, not take it over, just lift a little of the weight." Thomas didn't answer right away. He kept staring at the papers, the numbers that didn't even register as real. It was more money than the whole farm had seen in 3 generations. He closed the folder slowly. His voice came low, steady. "I've lost enough of this land already." Elise didn't blink, didn't argue. She just nodded, accepting it like it wasn't rejection, just clarity. "I understand," she said, taking the folder back. There was no bitterness in her tone, no pushback, just respect. But the next day she was still there, helping haul feed to the troughs, fixing the screen door that had whined on its hinges for 3 years, repainting the old shed by the orchard without asking, humming quietly to herself as she worked. She didn't need to own a piece of the land to care for it. She didn't need permission to pour herself into something just because it mattered. And Thomas, for all his stubborn pride, saw it. Some help comes in the form of contracts and signatures. Other times it shows up in worn boots and chipped paint, asking nothing but to be part of something honest. He had said no to the offer, but deep down he knew she was already investing in the one thing no one could put a price on. This life, this soil, him. The dust hadn't even settled from morning chores when the car rolled in, sleek, low to the ground, and so glossy it caught the reflection of the sky as it moved. It didn't belong on farm roads. Its tires crunched over gravel like it was offended by the terrain. Thomas stood by the tractor, wiping grease from his hands, brow furrowed. The car stopped near the barn. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a pressed blazer, hair too perfect, shoes too clean. He looked around like the whole landscape was a problem to be solved. Under one arm, he carried a long black tube of rolled-up blueprints, the kind used for skyscrapers or castles. Thomas didn't move, just narrowed his eyes as Elise stepped out from the house, walking calmly toward the visitor like she'd been expecting him all along. "Elise," Thomas said as she reached his side, "something you want to explain?" She folded her arms, glancing at the architect like he was no more than a clipboard with legs. "Don't worry, it's still your barn." Thomas looked between them. "Then why's he here?" "I just want to make it livable," she said, simple as that. "You said it yourself. The bones are good, but bones deserve flesh, warmth, light, purpose." The architect stepped forward, eager to speak. "It's nothing drastic. Modest insulation, structural reinforcement, restored windows, maybe a loft redesign. We're not altering its character, just honoring it." Thomas stared him down, then turned his gaze to Elise. "You planned this?" "I dreamed it," she admitted, "but I wouldn't have acted without knowing it was right." "Right by who?" "By you." The silence hung between them, taut but not hostile. She hadn't pushed papers this time, no contracts, just a man with a blueprint and a woman who saw potential in what everyone else had forgotten. Thomas exhaled, long and slow. "One condition," he said. Elise nodded, waiting. "No chandeliers, and no calling it a studio loft." She smiled. "Deal." The architect blinked. "You're serious?" Thomas cracked the faintest grin. "Dead serious." The conversation ended there. But something else had just begun. The barn, like everything else on the land, was no longer surviving. It was waking up. The blueprints came out on the kitchen table that night, spread wide across checkered cloth and the scent of roasted squash. Thomas leaned over them with a furrowed brow, squinting as if the paper might lie if he didn't look close enough. Elise stood beside him, mug in hand, Calm like this wasn't the most absurd thing she'd ever done. It wasn't a barn on the paper, not really. Oh, the bones were there, the familiar shape, the weather-worn silhouette, but everything else had been transformed. Skylights, reinforced beams, exposed wood, polished to a soft gleam, a reading nook tucked under the loft, window seats, a stone path curling through a garden where weeds used to grow wild. It looked magical. Thomas gave a low whistle and let out a small laugh, genuine and laced with disbelief. "You call this livable?" Elise didn't even flinch. "Every king needs a castle." He raised an eyebrow at her. "You see a king around here?" She sipped her tea. "He's covered in dirt and mule-stubborn pride, but yeah, I see him." Thomas shook his head, but the corners of his mouth gave him away. He kept staring at the sketch, tracing it with his calloused fingers. The place looked like something out of a storybook. Not fancy, not cold, just better. Elevated. Like someone had looked at the soul of the barn and asked, "What would you be if no one told you to stay broken?" "You really think this old place deserves all that?" he asked, quieter now. Elise looked at him, not at the paper, not at the measurements, at him. "It's not about what it deserves. It's about what it could be." He didn't respond right away, just sat down slowly, the weight of dreams he hadn't allowed himself to have settling on his shoulders. It wasn't just the barn she'd redrawn, it was him. And as he looked again at the plans, at the space where light would pour in through new windows, where warmth would gather under wooden beams, Thomas began to see it too, not a castle in the grand sense, but in the way that mattered. A shelter, a symbol, a home where something good had been rebuilt. The fire crackled low, casting golden light over the field's edge and dancing shadows across their faces. The sky above stretched wide and black, sprinkled with stars so clear they looked close enough to touch. Thomas leaned back in the old wooden chair he'd dragged out from the porch, boots crossed at the ankles, a warm cider in one hand and silence in the other. Elise sat across from him, her flannel sleeves rolled up, boots kicked off, and her hair down for once, loose and curled slightly from the barn's humidity. She held her mug like it was an anchor, something to ground her in a place that still felt foreign, yet familiar enough to keep her from leaving. They hadn't planned the fire. It had just happened, like most things between them. A pile of dry wood, a quiet evening, and two people who didn't feel like going to sleep yet. Thomas poked the logs with a stick. "You ever build anything that didn't come with a board vote and a legal team?" Elise chuckled. "Once, a sandcastle. I was 6. My brother knocked it over before it dried." He smirked. "Sounds about right." She sipped her cider and glanced at the stars. "I've built companies, divisions, portfolios, but nothing that lasted longer than a quarter's profit margin. Nothing that breathed." Thomas nodded, taking that in. "Built a lot of rows," he offered. "Corn, beans, a shed once with my dad, but it leaned left till the day it collapsed. Wife used to call it the drunken chicken coop." Elise laughed, the sound unguarded and real. "She sounds like she was something else." "She was," he said softly. "Still is, in the way things stick with you." The fire popped. A gust of wind swept the scent of burning cedar through the night. They sat in that pocket of warmth, trading stories. She told him about boardroom betrayals dressed in smiles, the pressure of always being right, the loneliness of rooms where power meant silence. He told her about frost-bitten mornings, about losing calves in spring, about the year the silo flooded and no one would buy from him again until it dried out. Neither tried to fix the other's stories. They just listened. And in that act, small, human, simple, something shifted. By the time the fire burned to embers, their chairs had moved a little closer, not quite touching, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like understanding. The frost came without warning, early, sharp, and cruel. One night of biting wind and brittle silence, and by morning, The fields were silvered over like a warning from the sky. Thomas stood at the edge of the land just after dawn, boots sinking into ground that should have stayed soft until November. Rows of green had turned to glass. The cabbage, the late beans, the tender shoots, all ruined, frozen mid-growth, like they'd been caught holding their breath. He didn't curse, didn't kick the dirt. He just walked out to the middle of it all and sat down, right there in the furrows, his coat unbuttoned, fingers raw, hands limp on his knees. There was nothing to be done, not this time. He'd seen this kind of loss before, but not like this. Not when he was already behind on feed, already gambling on this final stretch before winter, not when hope had finally started feeling real again. Elise found him there an hour later. No one told her, she just knew. She saw the untouched coffee on the porch, the open barn door, the stillness. And she followed it out into the field, the frost crunching under her borrowed boots. She didn't call his name, didn't ask what happened. The frozen silence answered for her. She simply walked over, eased down beside him in the cold soil, and folded her coat tighter around her. The ground bit at them both, the wind creeping through their clothes, but she didn't move. She didn't try to fix it, didn't offer platitudes, just let the ache of the earth settle between them like a third presence. Thomas didn't look at her, but he felt her there, steady, unflinching. After a long while he said quietly, "I thought I had one more shot." She reached out, brushed a bit of ice off a shriveled leaf, and said nothing. And somehow that silence did more than words ever could, because in that moment, what he needed wasn't a solution. It was someone who wouldn't walk away when the ground turned against him, someone who'd sit with him in the loss, in the dirt, in the quiet truth that sometimes things just die early, but not everything, not everyone. The knock came late in the afternoon, firm, impatient, the kind of knock that didn't belong in the country. Thomas opened the door with the weariness of a man who already knew what was on the other side. And there he was, suit too stiff, tie too tight, briefcase in hand, and apology rehearsed on his lips. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, not unkindly, "I'm afraid we need to talk about the loan." Thomas stepped aside without a word. He didn't need to hear it. He already knew the numbers were bleeding red. He'd scraped and stretched every dollar for seed, feed, fuel, banking on one last good harvest that never came. And now the frost had done its job. The fields were dead, and the debt was alive. They sat at the kitchen table while Elise lingered in the doorway, watching, quiet. The loan officer laid out the facts like cold dishes on a table, missed payments, final notices, a date circled in red, foreclosure paperwork ready, just waiting for the pen. Thomas listened, jaw tight. Pride was a bitter pill to swallow, but he took it whole. Elise didn't say a word, didn't try to intervene. Halfway through the conversation, she excused herself softly and stepped outside, letting the door click shut behind her. When the man left, briefcase lighter but posture straighter, Thomas didn't say much. He stood at the window for a while, watching Elise in the distance, her figure moving slowly through the edge of the orchard where nothing had bloomed in years. The sun dipped low. No one brought up the visit again that night. But the next morning, just after sunrise, Thomas walked into the kitchen and reached for his mug, only to find an envelope underneath it. No note, no signature, just a printed receipt from the bank, paid in full. The total circled, stamped, and dated. He stared at it for a long time, heart a quiet storm in his chest. He stepped outside, found her already up, kneeling in the garden, hands deep in frost-bitten soil. "Elise," he said. She looked up, brushing her hair behind one ear. "You paid it," he said. She didn't deny it, just gave a small shrug. Didn't want the land to forget who it belongs to. Thomas didn't have words, so he nodded, slow and grateful, because sometimes love doesn't show up in a kiss or a promise. Sometimes it shows up as a receipt slipped under a mug without a single word needed. The whispers began in the aisles of Maisie's Market and grew louder behind church pews and coffee cups. Maple Hollow was a town built on routine, where everyone knew everyone, and change moved slower than molasses. So when things began shifting out at the Hayes farm, people noticed. It started with the lights. The barn, long known for its sagging roof and leaning frame, now glowed gently at night. Warm yellow light spilling through new windows, not the cold flicker of flood lamps, but the kind that made it look lived in, alive, even. Then came the paint, not flashy, not garish, just new, clean white with rich red trim, as if someone had cared enough to bring it back to what it was meant to be. Mail carriers mentioned seeing stacks of lumber vanish like clockwork. The boys from the feed store swore they saw kitchen cabinets being hauled up the driveway in the back of a moving van. And Thomas? Thomas Hayes, the man who had gone years without more than a grunt in greeting, was suddenly smiling at the post office. He was carrying apple pies home again. He stood a little straighter, laughed a little longer. He even helped rehang the community bulletin board without being asked, a task he had dodged since his wife passed. But the biggest curiosity of all was her. The woman in the flannel shirts that didn't quite fit. The one who wore scuffed boots and carried feed like she'd been doing it her whole life, but who wore earrings that sparkled when the sun caught them, small but unmistakably real. Real diamonds in a place where most people wore costume jewelry twice removed. People started asking questions. Who is she really? She from the city? Some kind of philanthropist? Think she's buying the farm? But no one had an answer. Elise smiled kindly, tipped her hat when someone waved, and helped unload crates at the Saturday market like she'd always belonged. And the more she stayed, the more Maple Hollow didn't mind the mystery, because whatever her story was, it had brought light back to a barn, and laughter back to a man most had thought too far gone to smile again, and that, in a town like this, was enough, for now. It happened during the Saturday market, right as the town square was filling with chatter, clinking mason jars, and the scent of warm bread wafting from Maisie's bakery. The kids, as they always did, darted between booths like scattered marbles, chasing laughter and the occasional dropped apple. Emily, the Langleys' youngest, was tearing across the gravel in her red boots, too fast for the length of her legs. One moment she was mid-giggle, bright and wild, and the next she was down, knees on stone, palms skidded. A sudden sharp cry sliced through the autumn air and brought everything to a gentle hush. Elise was the first to reach her. She moved fast, but not rushed, not panicked, just calm, certain, like someone who had done this before, not necessarily with scraped knees, but with broken things, broken people. She knelt beside Emily, her shadow falling like shelter. The little girl's lip trembled, dirt smudged on her cheek, blood starting to bead on her knee. Elise didn't say, "You're okay." She didn't minimize it. She just reached into the small leather satchel she always carried, one Thomas suspected held a universe, and pulled out a small tin. Inside, gauze, ointment, and a perfectly folded Band-Aid. She peeled it with practiced hands, cleaned the scrape, and covered it gently. Emily sniffled. "It hurts." "I know," Elise said softly. "But look at that. You're still here. That's the important part." Emily blinked up at her. "Are you a doctor?" Elise smiled. "No, just someone who knows how to fix a few things." The little girl considered that, then asked the way children do when they're not afraid to be honest, "Can you fix everything?" Elise looked toward the horizon for a breath, then back at her. "Not everything," she said. "But the trick isn't to fix it all. It's to fix what's in front of you." Thomas, who had been watching from behind the fruit stand, felt something in his chest shift. Because in that moment, surrounded by pumpkins and apple cider, in a town still unsure who she really was, Elise Sinclair didn't look like a billionaire. She looked like someone who believed even small kindness could matter. And maybe that was the rarest fix of all. It started with a single shovel. One quiet morning, before the rooster had even cleared his throat, Elise stood behind the barn, boots pressed into soft, dew-soaked soil, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled into a loose knot. The old plot behind the barn had long since been forgotten, just a stretch of weedy land where thistles had taken over and rusted nails poked from rotting posts. It was the kind of place Thomas had learned to overlook, too small to farm, too wild to mow. But Elise didn't overlook it. She saw something else. By the time Thomas came around with his morning coffee, she'd already carved the first row. The scent of earth clung to the air, rich and hopeful. He stood at the edge of the plot, brow furrowed, watching her kneel in the dirt with her hands deep in the ground like she was coaxing secrets out of it. "Elise," he said, nodding toward the mess, "you planting more food back here?" She glanced up at him, eyes bright in the morning light. "Nope, just flowers." "Flowers?" he asked, as if the word itself was foreign. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "Cosmos, daisies, maybe some snapdragons if I can find seeds. That wild corner needs something soft." Thomas sipped his coffee. "You know they won't feed anyone." She smiled at that. "That's where you're wrong." He tilted his head, amused. "How do you figure?" She pressed a seed into the dirt, firm and sure. "Because beauty isn't a luxury, Thomas. It's a necessity, especially in places that have gone too long without it." He didn't answer right away, just looked around at the peeling wood of the barn, the weary fields, the house with its crooked porch rail. Then he looked back at her, sitting there with dirt under her nails and sunlight softening the angles of her face. "You think a few flowers can change all that?" "No," she said, "but they're a start." And somehow, that was enough. By the end of the week, shoots began to peek through. Green, defiant things, signs that even land left untouched and unloved for too long could still bloom. Just needed someone willing to see more than what had been. Someone willing to believe in color after a long stretch of gray. The envelope came by courier, sleek, white and heavy, in the way only urgent things are. It was waiting on the porch table when Elise returned from the greenhouse, her gloves still caked with soil and the scent of lavender clinging to her sleeves. She spotted it from the bottom step and froze. The logo on the corner was unmistakable. Sinclair and Locke. Her name, though no one in this town had said it aloud in weeks, was printed cleanly on the label. No first name, just E. Sinclair. She didn't open it right away. She carried it into the house like a hot coal, setting it gently on the kitchen counter, as if touching it too long might burn something down. The kettle boiled. The sun moved across the floor. She sat at the table and stared at it until the shadows changed. Eventually, she slit the envelope with a butter knife. The letter inside was concise. Official, the kind of language polished by lawyers and scrubbed of humanity. It summoned her to a board meeting in 3 weeks. No pleasantries. Just a line that hit harder than the rest. Failure to appear will be interpreted as abdication of executive authority and transfer of control. The paper trembled in her hands, though she held it tight. Not out of fear, not even anger, just the weight of old identity pressing against the shape of her new one. She didn't mention it to Thomas that night. He asked about the soil, about whether the sprouts behind the barn were taking. She smiled, told him the daisies were already reaching for the sun, but the envelope sat in the drawer, tucked beneath the grocery list and the spare flashlight. Later, long after he'd gone to bed, she stepped outside. The air was cool, the stars loud in their stillness. She looked out over the fields, the barn, the flower patch that didn't feed anyone but fed everything. It wasn't just a company they were asking her to return to. It was a world that didn't speak the same language she'd learned to love out here, where value was measured in yield and margin, not in mornings or mercy. But the choice was clear. Go back to power, or stay with what had finally made her feel real. And the clock had started ticking. The days didn't change on the outside. The chores still got done. The garden still grew. The barn still stood proudly in its new skin, catching the light like it had something to say. But something in Elise shifted, and Thomas felt it before he could name it. She stopped humming in the mornings. That was the first thing he noticed. Elise always hummed, quiet tunes with no real melody, sometimes trailing off into a whistle, sometimes half laughing to herself as she worked. It was how he'd learned she was happy, or at least comfortable. But for the past few days, that music had gone missing, replaced by a silence that clung to her like a second coat. She didn't stop moving. She still helped with the milking, still pulled weeds with her sleeves rolled up and dirt under her nails. But she didn't linger like she used to, didn't pause to admire the clouds or ask about crop cycles or trace the ridges of old tractor parts with curious fingers. She did the work, but not with the same heart. Thomas watched her quietly from the porch one afternoon as she watered the garden. Her movements were measured, too measured, like she was here, but already holding something far away. He didn't ask her about it, not right away. He never had to press Elise for anything. She talked when she wanted to, shared when it was ready, but that didn't mean he didn't feel it. That evening she skipped dinner, said she wasn't hungry, said she had some things to write. The plate he left for her sat untouched on the counter. Later that night she sat on the steps outside the barn, staring into the dark. Thomas walked past her on his way in, nodded but didn't speak. She looked up and gave him a soft smile, but not the kind that reached her eyes. And in that moment he knew something was pulling her, maybe back to that city, maybe back to the life she'd tried to walk away from. He didn't know the details, but he knew that silence, the kind that came when someone was already starting to say goodbye, even if they hadn't found the words yet. He just hoped, whatever it was, she'd say it out loud before it was too late. The sun hadn't fully risen. The sky was still bruised with dawn, a soft indigo fading into gold, and the world felt paused, like it was holding its breath. The house was quiet, save for the low creak of old floorboards under cautious steps. Elise stood by the door with a small canvas bag at her feet and a jacket draped over her arm. She wasn't dressed for chores. She wasn't even dressed for Maple Hollow. Her boots were polished. Her hair was tied back in that careful, deliberate way she used to wear it, like armor. The envelope from the city was gone from the drawer. She reached for the doorknob with a quiet resolve. No drama, no notes, no goodbyes, just a clean exit before she got in any deeper. But before her fingers could touch the handle, she heard it, the low shuffle of boots behind her. She turned slowly. Thomas stood in the hallway, backlit by the amber glow of the kitchen light, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes steady. He must have known. Somehow, even without words, he always knew when the wind was about to change. They didn't speak for a long moment. Then, quietly but clearly, he said, "Stay." She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to explain, but he stepped closer, closing the space between them with a certainty that rattled her more than anything. "Not for the barn," he said, voice thick with something he rarely let anyone see. "For me." Her breath caught. He didn't reach for her, didn't beg, just stood there with a truth so simple it broke through all the noise. She looked down at the bag, then back at him. And in that silence, something inside her cracked, not in a way that hurt, but in the way ice breaks just before a river runs free. "I was scared," she whispered. "So am I," he said, "but I'd rather be scared with you than fine without you." The jacket slipped from her arm, and for the first time in a long time, Elise let herself choose something that didn't make sense on paper, but made all the sense in the world. The next morning came with the kind of light that felt like a clean slate, golden, gentle, unassuming. The fields, still bearing the scars of early frost, looked softer somehow, like the land had finally exhaled. Thomas didn't ask questions when Elise showed up by the shed with gloves already on and a shovel over her shoulder. She was dressed in old denim again, her sleeves rolled up, boots muddied from the walk across the pasture. The city jacket was gone, so was the bag by the door. She didn't say she was staying. She didn't need to. They spent the day working side by side, redigging rows and spreading compost, as if their hands could convince the soil to forgive the season. No big talks, no confessions, just the quiet rhythm of two people mending something wordlessly. At midday, Elise disappeared for a moment. When she returned, she held a folded letter in her hand, the board summons, now slightly worn at the edges. She didn't wave it like a flag. She didn't burn it dramatically. She simply walked to the small patch behind the barn, the one she'd cleared for her flower garden, and knelt beside the hole she'd dug the week before for a tree they hadn't planted yet. Thomas watched from a few feet away, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. She looked over her shoulder, gave a small, knowing smile, and then pressed the letter into the earth. Gently, like it was a delicate thing she was finally ready to let go of. Over it, she lowered the sapling. A peach tree, young, thin, hopeful. As she patted the soil into place, she said softly, "I figured if I was going to bury something, I might as well grow something over it." Thomas didn't reply, just walked over and handed her the water pail. Together, they soaked the roots, the sun warming their backs. The wind carried the scent of soil and leaves and something else, something like relief. And beneath that tree, something stayed buried, not hidden, just laid to rest. Her answer wasn't a press release or a resignation letter, it was a tree, and that was enough. The invitation had come weeks ago, gold-trimmed, hand-delivered, the kind that smelled faintly of perfume and power. A billion-dollar gala at the Sinclair Tower rooftop, filled with CEOs, hedge fund giants, and champagne that cost more than most people's mortgages. Her name had been printed on the program, Elise Sinclair, Guest of Honor. A speech was expected. A dress had been tailored. Her place at the table had been carved in crystal. But the morning of the event, Elise wasn't in the city. She was under a tractor. Thomas had been wrestling with the old Massey Ferguson since dawn, cursing softly and covered in grease by the time she found him outside the barn, sleeves already rolled up. "Need a second pair of hands?" she asked, wiping toast crumbs from her mouth. He grunted. "Unless those hands know how to coax a busted fuel line into forgiving me, probably not." "I'll take my chances," she said, dropping to the ground beside him. And just like that, the city faded. No heels, no speeches, no sterile lights or carefully curated conversations. Just the satisfying clink of tools, the scent of earth and diesel, and the occasional string of colorful words from Thomas when something didn't quite line up. Elise didn't flinch. She laughed. And when the grease smeared across her cheek, she didn't wipe it away. She leaned into it. At one point, Thomas handed her a wrench and said, half teasing, "Pretty sure your board wouldn't approve of this." She shrugged, tightening a bolt with a firm twist. "Pretty sure I don't care." When they finally got the engine to turn over with a sputtering cough and a triumphant roar, Thomas sat back and looked at her, hair tousled, shirt stained, and eyes alight. "You missed your gala," he said. She looked down at her hands, blackened and raw, then up at the sky overhead, clear and wide and full of everything that mattered. "I didn't miss anything," she said. "I just chose something better." And the tractor, tired and stubborn, rumbled like it agreed. The package arrived just after lunch, left in the dented old mailbox at the end of the gravel lane. Thomas carried it in under one arm, the box light but long, wrapped in brown paper, and sealed with city tape. No return address, just her name, written in a handwriting too clean to be personal. "Elise," he called, setting it on the kitchen table. She came in a minute later, wiping flour from her palms, her hair pulled back with a red bandana. She eyed the package, wary but curious. He handed her a knife. She didn't ask who it was from, she already knew. Inside was a painting, a watercolor of the Hayes farm. Not as it looked now, but as it had looked the year before she arrived, before the roof had been mended, before the barn glowed at night, before flower beds softened the corners of everything. The painting was beautiful in a way that felt sterile, the grass too green, the sky too calm, the barn too tragic in its tilt, a ghost of what was. She stared at it for a long time. Thomas watched her carefully, but said nothing. Elise finally exhaled and ran her fingers over the edge of the canvas. It's from the firm, a reminder of legacy. They probably thought I'd want to hang it in my office. He nodded slowly. Do you? She shook her head, lips pressed together. No, it's not my story anymore. Not mine to carry. She turned, opened the drawer by the sink, and pulled out the photo they'd taken 2 weeks ago by the silo, the one Maisie had snapped during the fall fair, when Thomas had one arm slung over her shoulder and they were both laughing at something no one remembered now. She removed the painting from its frame and replaced it with the photo. No ceremony, no speeches, just a quiet swap. Then she walked over and set it on the mantel beside the radio, where the morning light always hit. Thomas stepped beside her, hands in his pockets. Looks better already. She smiled. Yeah, now it looks real. And the painting? She folded it gently, wrapped it back in the paper, and slid it under the bed, where old things belonged. Not erased, just out of the way of what was growing now. The town square came alive with golden light and the smell of roasted corn, apple cider, and cinnamon-dusted pies. Every storefront had pumpkins lined up out front, their carved faces flickering with candlelight as dusk settled in. Lanterns swung gently from the trees and laughter drifted through the crisp air like music in its own right. It was Maple Hollow's annual harvest dance, half celebration, half tradition, all heart. Thomas hadn't planned on going. He never did. Not since her. The music always felt a little too loud, the company a little too kind, the memories too close. But Elise had asked, no pressure, just a soft, curious glance, and a, "You ever go to these things?" And now, here he was, boots scuffed, sleeves rolled up, leaning against the wooden post near the cider stand while the band tuned up and people started filling the dance floor. Elise didn't look like a guest tonight. She looked like she belonged. She wore old jeans and a flannel shirt she'd borrowed from Thomas weeks ago, the one that never made it back to his closet. Her hair was down, loosely curled at the ends, and her smile came easy. She was spinning in circles with little Emily Langley when he saw her, both of them laughing, their arms flung wide like windmills. The music picked up, a slow, easy two-step that settled the crowd, and that's when Thomas moved. He didn't second-guess it, didn't wait for the next song. He just walked up, cleared his throat, and offered a hand. "Elise," he said, a little awkward, a little shy, "you care to dance?" She looked up, surprised, a flicker of something unspoken behind her eyes. Then her smile returned, fuller this time. "I thought you didn't dance." "I make exceptions," he said. They stepped into the soft glow of string lights, boots brushing gravel, hands folding into each other like they'd always known how. They swayed gently, no fancy steps, no need for rhythm beyond the steady pull between them. The town watched. But it didn't feel like a stage. It felt like a beginning. And for the first time, under twinkling lights and the hum of fiddle strings, neither of them was running. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. The day of the reveal arrived quietly, without banners or speeches or press. Just sunlight falling warm over the ridge, the scent of wood shaving still lingering in the air, and a hand-painted sign hung above the wide barn doors, the Castle Barn, grown with grit, built for good. The whole town showed up anyway. Word had spread the way things always did in Maple Hollow, not through flyers, but through whispered curiosity, coffee counter chatter, and the steady hum of small-town wonder. Everyone wanted to see what Elise and Thomas had been building, not just with hammers and nails, but with time, with trust, with something no contractor could invoice. When the barn doors swung open, it wasn't just the structure that took people's breath, it was the soul of it, exposed beams curved overhead like a cathedral of wood and memory. Old barn wood had been polished but preserved, etched with names of the past, carved gently into cornerstones. The floor was smooth pine. The loft had been transformed into a reading nook with wide pillows and sunlit windows, overlooking fields that still bore scars but now held promise. And in the center, long tables, workbenches, open shelves of tools, seed jars, old books on crop rotation and weather patterns. A classroom without desks, a school without walls. Children ran from station to station wide-eyed, pressing their hands into dirt trays, learning how to graft apple trees, to weld a simple frame, to mend a cracked boot. Retired farmers offered lessons. Local teachers volunteered time. Maisie brought pie. No one asked what the place used to be. They only talked about what it was now. Thomas stood back near the door, watching it all, arms crossed over his chest. Elise moved through the space like she'd lived in it her whole life, helping kids tie apron strings, explaining the parts of a tractor engine to a 12-year-old with oil already on his cheek. When someone asked, "What made you think to do this here?" she simply said, "Because this place taught me how to rebuild. It only felt right to pass it on." And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and light, the barn wasn't just repaired. It had been reborn, a castle, not of stone or wealth, but of purpose. The sky turned the color of bruised steel just after supper. The air grew thick and still, the kind of stillness that meant something was coming. A low rumble stirred in the distance, slow at first, then steady, like a heartbeat approaching. Thomas looked up from the porch where he'd been sharpening a blade, and Elise met his eyes from the kitchen doorway. No words were needed. The storm was back. But this time, no one rushed. There were no frantic checks on roof patches or leaks, no scramble for flashlights. The barn, once a trembling thing at the mercy of the wind, now stood tall and steady. Its new frame creaked only gently as the first drops of rain began to tap on the roof, like an old friend returning. Thomas grabbed 2 mugs and filled them with cider, while Elise lit the lantern near the barn staircase. They climbed to the loft, not hurried, just comfortable, like it had always been a place meant to hold them both. Upstairs, the window stretched wide over the field. The first crack of lightning lit the horizon, followed by a roll of thunder that rumbled through the floorboards. Elise sat down near the sill, cross-legged on the old woven blanket she'd laid there days ago, and Thomas joined her, shoulders brushing as they settled into the hush between heartbeats. The rain came hard and fast after that, drumming against the new roof, sliding down the windows in silver streaks. But inside, everything was calm. The air smelled like cedar and dust and apples. Safe. Elise rested her head gently against his shoulder, her voice barely above the storm. "You still hate thunderstorms?" He smiled. "Not when I'm not facing them alone." They sat there for a long time, watching the lightning leap across the sky, saying nothing more. There was no fear now, no loneliness. Just 2 people in a barn that had once been broken, sheltering from a storm they no longer had to face apart. And as the thunder rolled on, it wasn't a threat anymore. It was a reminder of how far they'd come, and how somehow this place, and each other, had weathered everything. The black car came without warning, dust curling behind its wheels as it rolled up the gravel path like it had never been lost. It didn't belong here, not with its polished shine and sharp lines, not with the way it idled like it was waiting to be obeyed. Elise saw it first, standing at the edge of the garden. Her hands were dirt-stained, her boots caked from the morning's work. She straightened slowly, watching the door open, her breath caught somewhere between memory and dread. And then he stepped out. Robert Sinclair. Towering, silver-haired, precise. The kind of man who wore his wealth like a second skin. Immaculate suit, tailored coat. The weight of legacy behind every glance. He scanned the property like he was assessing damage. His eyes landed on Elise, then on the barn. He didn't smile. "Elise Guy," he said, "get your things." She didn't move. "You've made your point," he continued. "Let's go. There's a board meeting next week and a dozen investors waiting on your return." Thomas stepped out of the barn then, wiping his hands on a rag, sensing the tension thick in the air. He stopped a few steps away, not interfering, but close enough to be there if he was needed. Elise took a breath, slow and grounding. Then she walked forward, calm and sure, and stopped a few feet from her father. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. His brow furrowed. "This isn't who you are." She shook her head. "No, this is who I am when no one's telling me who I'm supposed to be. Elise, be reasonable. This place isn't your life." She glanced toward the barn, the field, the tree behind it that had begun to bloom. Her gaze softened. It is now. He stared at her like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. "You're welcome to stay," she added, her voice quiet but steady. "There's a guest room and the cider's good, but if you came to take me back, you've wasted the trip." For the first time, Robert Sinclair had no immediate reply. And behind her, Thomas smiled, not because she chose him, but because she finally chose herself. The morning was the kind that wrapped itself in stillness. No wind, no chores urgent enough to chase. Just the soft clink of ceramic as Thomas set down two mismatched coffee mugs on the porch rail and settled into the chair beside her. Elise was barefoot, legs tucked under her, the hem of his flannel shirt brushing her knees. Her hair was still damp from the garden hose mishap earlier, but she hadn't bothered to fix it. She looked like summer felt, warm, undone, and entirely unbothered. They sat in silence, watching the sun stretch across the field. The peach tree behind the barn had begun to take root, stubborn and quiet, just like the people who planted it. Thomas didn't have a speech. He hadn't practiced anything. All he had was this moment and a feeling that had grown roots of its own. He cleared his throat, ran a thumb around the edge of his mug, and said, "I don't have a ring." Elise turned slightly, eyebrows raised, but not surprised. "I don't have a plan," he added. "No candles, no kneeling, no perfect moment." She waited, patient. "But I've got this porch and this coffee and you and I was just wondering." He paused, then looked her dead in the eye, not with fear, but with hope. "Would it be okay if this was forever?" She blinked, not because she was unsure, but because something in the simplicity of it reached too deep to answer right away. No diamonds, no crowd, just truth, spoken in the language of slow mornings and shared silence. She set her mug down next to his, scooted her chair close enough for their knees to touch, and leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "That sounds just about perfect," she whispered. And that was it. No fireworks, no announcements, just two people on a sunlit porch choosing each other the same way they'd chosen everything else, with quiet certainty, and hearts already halfway there. The evening settled in soft and golden, the kind of dusk that painted everything it touched with a quiet kind of magic. The barn cast a long shadow across the field, and the porch light hadn't been turned on yet. It didn't need to be. The sky was still holding its glow, and the world, for once, felt perfectly still. They had wandered down to the edge of the orchard, where the ground was bare and the breeze carried the scent of wild clover. Thomas walked beside her, his hand brushing hers now and then, not by accident, but by choice. Neither spoke. Words felt too small for what had been said that morning. They stopped near the old stump where the fence line curved. Elise bent down, picked up a stick, and knelt in the dirt. Thomas watched her quietly, unsure of what she was doing until he saw it. She began to draw, simple lines, no flourishes, just 3 letters carved into the earth as if they belonged there, E plus T. She leaned back on her heels, wiped her hands on her jeans, and looked up at him. Not smiling, not grinning, just steady. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't needed. He knelt beside her, brushing his fingertips over the marks she'd left in the soil, and nodded once. That was all he needed. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive in declarations or grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up in a line drawn in the dirt, in a name shared between two hearts that stopped looking for reasons and started listening to what was already true. No vows, no rings, just roots. And under that quiet stretch of sky, something deeper than promises was planted. It was already growing. The morning the sign went up, the whole town seemed to pause. Not out of ceremony, there wasn't one. No speeches, no ribbon to cut. Just Thomas with a toolbox, Elise holding the ladder steady, and the slow creak of wood meeting wood as he fastened the final bolt. The sign had been carved by hand, sanded smooth and stained the color of old whiskey. The letters were bold but not boastful, etched deep with care and a steadiness that came from knowing exactly what they stood for. Hayes Farmstead, grown with grit, rebuilt with grace. Below it, hung from two simple chains, was a second piece of wood, smaller, newer. Its letters curved just slightly as if someone had smiled while carving them. Castle Barn Learning Center. Elise stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans as Thomas climbed down the ladder. They stood side by side in the morning light, the scent of cut grass and old cedar in the air. For a while they didn't say anything. They just looked at it. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration, a closing of a chapter, and the opening of one they never knew they were writing. The farm, once seen by the town as a place fading with time, now pulsed with life. Kids ran through the barn's open doors, voices echoing off the beams. The garden behind the silo bloomed with color. The tractor, freshly painted and somehow still held together by stubbornness and Elise's grease-stained hands, sat proudly near the workshop. People began to stop at the gate when they passed, some to admire, some to ask questions, many just to smile. Maisie brought over a bouquet of fresh sunflowers later that day, sticking them in a milk jug by the entrance. "I figured this place finally has a name worth visiting," she said. Thomas looked at Elise, her cheeks flushed from the sun, her eyes full of that same quiet fire that changed everything. "It's more than a name," he said softly. "It's a story." And now it had a sign to prove it. The journalist showed up on a Tuesday, right between a tractor repair and a peach cobbler that refused to set. He didn't wear a tie, but he did carry a camera bag and that particular kind of curiosity that never quite sits still. Elise spotted him first, stepping out of a dusty sedan with a notebook in hand and questions in his eyes. He introduced himself politely, said a reader had tipped him off about a barn that was turning heads and hearts, and asked if they had a few minutes to talk. Thomas raised an eyebrow, but Elise just smiled. "Sure," she said, "as long as you don't mind helping lift some feed while we talk." He agreed, so they talked, not in an office, not in front of some pristine backdrop, but right there in the middle of a sunlit barn, where kids were painting wooden signs and a calf napped under the old grain table. The journalist asked the usual things, about the farm, about the community space, about the learning center. Elise answered with ease, Thomas with fewer words but just as much weight. Eventually the question came. "Is it true?" the reporter asked, pen poised. "You're Elise Sinclair, from Sinclair and Locke?" She didn't flinch, just nodded. "I was." He scribbled something down, then looked at her again, a little more carefully. "And now?" Elise glanced around, at the garden blooming behind the barn, at the kids tying knots in rope, at Thomas cleaning a set of tools near the open doors. "Now I'm someone who remembered where value really lives." The article went live 3 days later. "She was a billionaire, he was a farmer, but this castle grew more than crops." It spread faster than they expected. The photo on the front page showed Elise leaning against the barn door, Thomas beside her, both laughing at something unimportant. The kind of image you couldn't stage. People wrote in, sent letters, donations. Volunteers asked how they could help. City kids wanted to visit. Other farms asked to replicate the idea. But Thomas didn't care about the buzz. All that mattered to him was that the story was true, not the headlines, not the title, just the fact that something had grown here, something real, something rooted, and the world was finally paying attention to what they'd built with calloused hands and open hearts. The attic was warm and dust-sweet, filled with the kind of quiet only old houses know. Sunlight slanted through the small window, illuminating motes of dust as they drifted through the air like secrets waiting to be found. She was 8, barefoot and curious, with a stubborn streak and the same honey-brown eyes as her father. Her name was Grace, named not for her elegance, but for the thing that had saved them all. She was supposed to be looking for an old blanket. Instead, she found the box, tucked behind a stack of faded quilts and an old lamp with a bent shade. It was marked in black ink, slightly smudged from time and touch. Home begins here. Grace dragged it out, pried off the lid with determined fingers, and pulled out the rolled sheets inside. Paper crackled as she unwrapped them on the attic floor, careful not to tear. What she found wasn't treasure in the usual sense, no jewels or letters or long-lost maps, just drawings, blueprints, the barn. She studied them with the seriousness only a child could bring to something she didn't fully understand. Arrows, lines, sketches of windows and beams, measurements scribbled in a different hand. One corner had a coffee stain shaped like a crescent moon. Another had a doodle of a peach tree, drawn in pencil. She heard footsteps on the stairs and called out, "Mama?" Elise appeared in the doorway, a dish towel still slung over her shoulder. She paused when she saw the papers laid out, then smiled softly. Grace looked up. "Did you really build this together?" Elise stepped closer, kneeling beside her. She traced the edge of the blueprint with her finger. "No, sweetheart," she said, voice warm and full of something deeper than memory. "We built us." And in the quiet of that attic, with sunlight warming old paper and the scent of peaches drifting up from the orchard below, the little girl nodded as if she understood, because somehow she did.